All right, 5-2, limits to growth. In this section, we're going to focus on these resources and factors that are actually going to impact population growth, and in these cases, we're talking about limiting factors. So what definition-wise is a limiting factor? We are talking about things that a population needs that when they become in short supply, that's going to limit population growth. It's the thing that the population needs, or it's a thing that the population needs to survive. And and we're going to talk about two different kinds of them, but so a required nutrient or a resource that causes population growth to decrease as that factor becomes an issue. Two main types of these limiting factors. First one is what we call density-dependent factor. A density-dependent factor, remember what we meant by population density from the last section? Give you a second to think about that. Right? Population density is how many organisms we have living in a given area at a given time. So you have something called a density-dependent factor. And so what that means is, as the density of a population increases, right, as the population increases, so does the density dependent factor. Hard to write with my finger. Density dependent factor. And this density dependent factor then starts to put pressure on the population, limiting the growth of that population. Okay? We will talk more about what are density dependent factors in just a bit. But the second type then are density independent factors. So you can kind of figure out from the name there, if density dependent is determined by how many organisms we have, then density independent is not impacted by that. So let's first look at density dependent factors. What are we talking about here? It is a limiting factor whose impact increases or decreases with population size. So they are what we call, sorry, hold on one second. Time out. There we go. They are what we call proportional with one another. So these limiting factors, as the population rises, like we said, so does this factor's influence on the population, limiting the growth of that population and bringing it back down. Remember that exponential growth curve, right? As that curve went up and up and up, it reached a point, and then it started to taper back off by carrying capacity. That's what a density-dependent factor does. Okay, it limits when the population's density reaches a critical level. It's not always a problem. You know, as that population is growing, you know, on that exponential curve, when it's nice and slow, plenty of water, plenty of food. But as the population grows, then this factor kicks in and starts limiting growth. It has the greatest impact. These types of factors have the greatest impact when populations are large and dense. So the larger the population and the smaller the area that they live in, will then, you know, cause a greater impact on our population. So if you have a smaller population, or a smaller population that is scattered over a wide area, a large area, these density dependent factors don't have as big of a role. So large populations that are very dense, that's when these density dependent limiting factors become a problem. Good examples of density dependent factors: predation, right? There's, you know, the ageless examples of the lynx and the hare population, and the wolf and the moose population, and the coyote and the rabbit population is also an example of predation. Competition is another example of a density dependent factor that increases as the population gets larger. And then parasitism and disease. So as you can see by this little image, it's not always the clearest, but these are all examples of density-dependent limiting factors. You have, you know, the water buffalo fighting, up here in the corner, competition. You have the alligator preying on some organism there. You have parasitism being shown in those examples. Even microbes are things that will cause disease in larger populations that are living in very dense environments. So these are all good examples of density-dependent limiting factors. Competition then, let's break them down real quick. Here's another example of competition. As population increases, you have more competition for those essentials: food, water, space, sunlight, mating privileges, all those things. And because we're not just talking about, notice I said sunlight, we're not talking about animals' needs to get a tan. We're talking about plants, right? Plants have to have sun, and they're living organisms, and they are under the same influence of density-dependent limiting factors just like animals are. So competition is one important density-dependent factor. So, obviously competition increases because the more individuals you have present, the sooner they're going to use up your resources, and then competition will increase. So as population goes up, so does competition. Now there are two different types of competition. We have competition between members of the same species that we call intra-specific competition. That is a specific, that is a type of competition between members of the same species, like in our pictures of the deer up here fighting. Same species, fighting whether it's for territory, mate, food, whatever, but it's intra-specific competition. And then we have the other type of competition. We don't just worry about populations, living of the same species in one area. You have many different populations that make up a community. If we remember our ecological terminology, right, a community is several different populations living in one area. So, we have competition for resources. Like in this picture, you have the zebras and, what are those? Okay, I got to think of the name of the other animal. Anyway, you have those animals fighting, or at least competing, for water sources in different areas. That's what we call interspecific competition, okay? Which is competition between different species for a resource. And we know that interspecific competition, being able to compete with other populations of different species, is a very important mechanism of evolutionary change, because there is pressure on one of those two species to adapt to a new environment, because they're under pressure to decrease the competition, because it is a rule that it's a rule of nature that two species cannot inhabit the same niche, right? The word niche or niche, that's an E, is the ecological term that means role in the environment, and two species cannot inhabit the same niche, or they will fight. Over time, those species may eventually evolve then to occupy separate niches, or one of them will die off. They can't both survive there. Second density-dependent factor is predation, and so here we have our lynx in our hair. Looks like the hair might be able to get away there. But predator-prey relationships are one of the best known population control mechanisms. They're the widest studied. There's all kinds of research on them. And they're interesting to see how when one group increases, the other one increases, and vice versa. When one goes down, the other goes down. The best example, one of the best documented examples, is that moose-wolf relationship on Isle Royale, which is an island in Lake Superior. And on that island you have moose and wolf, and so they're kind of in an enclosed environment. And so what we have found here over time is that, and you can see by the chart, as the moose population there in green, peaks, what shortly follows that, peak in the moose population, oh, look at that, a peak in the wolf population as well, right? So here's my moose population starting to peak, and then the predator has a nice big, boom in population here on the purple line. It peaks here. But then as that peaks, what happens to my moose population? Well, when there's more predators, the prey species is going to suffer, so the moose population drops. And not too shortly after that, we also see, bam, a bottoming out of the wolves as well. And so then the moose population will climb again. So it's a cycle. And this cycle, as long as the resources and the environment stays stable, this cycle can be repeated over and over and over indefinitely. Another density-dependent factor is parasitism and disease. Yes, that is a picture, a cartoon image there of an intestine and a parasite in it. Guess that parasite. Parasites can limit population growth, and the more individuals you have in a population, the faster that parasite's going to spread because it needs a host. So parasites can be just about anything. They can be microscopic bacteria. They can be protists. Real quick, protists are single-celled organisms that can be plant-like or animal-like, amoebas, paramecium, sarcodina, flagellates. They can be any small organism. So you can have a parasite that's a bacteria. You can also have a parasite that is like a liver fluke or tapeworms, like this picture is showing us tapeworms, that can be 30 centimeters in length. They can run, some of them can run the length of an intestine. So, parasites really do vary. The thing about a parasite, though, is that they don't kill their host, right? You kill your host and you die because you are being carted around by your host. So their nourishment depends on the host population and maintaining that host population. However, host population may suffer, it may weaken, it may start to decline, and as that happens, so does the parasite. So that parasite-host relationship it runs the same cycle as the predator-prey relationship does as well. So that takes us to our second type of limiting factor, and we call that the density-independent factor. So if all those other things that we just got done talking about, predation, competition, parasitism, if we talk about those and that they are influenced by population density, right, by population size, then density-independent factors are not impacted by the population. As a matter of fact, they affect populations of all sizes in the same way. So we're not talking about competition here. What we're talking about for density-independent factors, things that no matter how many organisms you have in your population, this factor, when it occurs or as it takes its toll on a population, it will have the same impact. So natural disasters, right? An earthquake is an earthquake. A flood is a flood. Unusual weather patterns will have the same impact on a small population as it does on a large population. Obviously, a large population will suffer greater losses, but the impact is still the same. Human activities, clear-cutting forests, knocking out, rainforest, building strip malls, building, farming, agriculture, all those things are density-independent factors. It does not matter how many organisms you have in the population, the impact is still the same. And when this happens, oftentimes a species will crash as these factors occur. Some of them, it just depends on the species. Sometimes that species can rebound because it's not a, something that is still always present. Sometimes that population can rebound, sometimes it cannot. The problem with these factors is that just like we saw in the predator-prey relationship, you cannot impact one population and have no impact on anything else in the ecosystem. Because as we learned, I'm sure back in 5th grade, 6th grade, whatever that was, food webs, food chains, everything is interconnected. So if you impact one level, one trophic level, you are going to impact everything below it and everything above it. So many others, then it says, are also affected because of the interactions of species in our ecosystems. So we have density-dependent factors and density-independent factors. These are the two types of factors that are going to limit population growth.